Hello, my name is Stephen Hegrick, and at the time of this recording, I am staff on loan from the American Red Cross, supporting the IFRC on the Integrated Assistance Model. And in this presentation, I'll be covering the digital enrollment part of that wider topic. So the first two slides that I have are going to help contextualize this subject. This first one will help me illustrate the complementary approach we're taking to enroll people in the programs that national societies are offering. The door at the very bottom is the in-person model, and it's the one that most national societies and other agencies use today. So it's where people can come to a reception center or a branch or a chapter of the Red Cross, present information to them, find out about programs, register, and if eligible, receive support. The door that's just above that is the full self-enrollment, which is what we built during the Ukraine response operation. And that's what I'll be covering in the presentation, where people use their own devices to create accounts, learn about programs, and receive services. And then just at the very top is an assisted self-enrollment track, and its purpose is to support people who probably could access the self-enrollment, but just need a little help. So I'd say this is maybe someone like my parents who have a smartphone and access to the internet, but maybe not so confident in using it for more than just making or receiving telephone calls. Now, the second slide is showing the wider ecosystem of the integrated assistance model, where the self-enrollment model sits. So that's those figures that are circled in red at the top of the screen. The idea of an integrated assistance model is so that we have a number of different needs at a national society level, across the federation, and even across the movement that can be met by a variety of different tools. What we're looking to do now is to identify the best tools to meet those needs, and where possible, see where these connections can be made so that national societies can have both options and potentially an integrated system where they can provide services end to end. So I won't go through all the details of the components, but I wanted to highlight that in addition to this just being a complementary approach, it's also one tool out of a wider ecosystem that we're using to respond to a variety of needs. So this slide is just providing some background on the problem that this tool was meant to address and those opportunities that were present in Europe during the Ukraine crisis that allowed us to create it. So in addition to things just like the sheer scale of the crisis, many of the national societies along the border of Ukraine were not just smaller in size, but also many were focused on social services to vulnerable people that they still had to continue even while they were facing this increased need. We also have to remember these were Polish volunteers, Slovakian volunteers, Hungarian volunteers. They were all speaking their national language, which was already going to be a natural barrier to people who were coming out speaking Ukrainian and Russian. Now, that was only further complicated by the nature of the movement of people. So although there were humanitarian assistance points set up and they had branches throughout the countries, people were coming across at a variety of points and they weren't always congregating in capital cities. And people even sometimes continued to move back and forth. So they'd go back into Ukraine and sometimes they'd come into a different country. So it was really difficult to know where they needed to focus their resources. So on the opportunity side, we knew really early on that using cash grants as a way to address needs was highly feasible. That wasn't an issue. We also knew that there was a high penetration of smartphones with the population, as well as a high level of digital literacy and access to the internet. They also had identification and were willing to show it in order to start the process of temporary protection. So again, I'm just highlighting these here to provide a little bit of background as to why this particular tool was developed. A national society perspective, it's a tool that a local Red Cross or Red Crescent staff can digitize the program that they would normally only offer face-to-face. They're also able to remotely review and validate accounts and applications. So even though there's a lot of automation in the process, there's always going to be some amount of human review and validation. They can also look at all this information that's coming in, and they can really look for things that they might otherwise not have. They can use it to inform their programs or even their coordination with governments and other organizations. They can also deduplicate across programs in their country and across borders and with other agencies. And then finally, where possible, such as like digital cash, they can provide direct assistance through the application. Perspective. So we often mention that one of the principles we wanted to keep in mind when developing this is to offer a degree of parity with other global applications that are frequently used by all of us in our day-to-day lives, usually only for convenience, but have never really been applied to a humanitarian context. This kind of leads us to one of the foundational concepts of AccessRC, which is that it's an account-based application. So if you kind of think of what Uber did back in 2011, they started allowing people to carry their account with them once they left one particular city where they live, or maybe travel to a new part of the country or even a different country. They didn't need to resubmit all of their information every time they went to a new location. And this was really a game changer for them because they knew that wherever people went with this application and the service was provided, they'd be able to use that application without a lot of effort or a lot of friction. So this also enables the users to control their own data. And the next is really around remote engagement. So this will allow us not just to send messages to people with accounts, but also they can send tickets back. And I kind of mentioned this on I think the previous slide around how national societies can also deliver services and even distribute cash through it. So these two things together, along with a location service, means that as people cross borders, they're able to immediately see what's available, and they have the ability to apply directly through the application. So, for example, if someone were to leave Ukraine and go to Poland in the summertime, they may have found that the Polish Red Cross was offering a multi-purpose cash program for basic needs. If they later then decided to move to Montenegro at the end of summer, maybe just before the kids went back to school, they may have seen that the Montenegrin Red Cross was offering an education program. Perhaps a different scenario might be that, if somebody went to Bulgaria in the wintertime, they may have been eligible for like a one-off cash disbursement for winterization. And then if later maybe they moved to the Baltic so they could take care of an elderly relative, they would have found out the Lithuanian Red Cross was offering a health program. The model was created and used by the Ukraine response team in Budapest and with the national societies in Europe. And sort of over the last maybe 6 months, the question arose, could we use it somewhere else? So in order to do that, it was decided we'd enter into a validation phase. And during this phase, we'd bring together all the individual departments with whom we previously engaged at various points during the development, all together in one place at one time, and also look for another use case where we could test the various aspects of the model. So this led us to a small pilot in Colombia with the migrant population from Venezuela. We started that in November and December of 2023. And as the date of this recording, we still have another week to go before we have our lessons learned workshop in Bogota and participate in a regional event in late January. The intention is to not only test the individual features, but also the onboarding process, the support model needed, and a number of other performance indicators. So for this particular slide, there'll be more information to come on that subject in the future. Because many people still ask us what's next. And although it's not a given, we're going to be using this in the Caribbean in the immediate future, it's a really interesting use case, particularly if we could introduce this to a national society's preparedness program. So I use the Caribbean only because the Bahamas was the last disaster I deployed to before Ukraine and just before COVID. So I've been to many Caribbean islands on operations in the past. So the example I'm giving is fairly typical, at least from my perspective and my experience. So here in the slide, I'm showing what obviously normally happens is a hurricane comes, some people stay, some are displaced, and then the national society, sometimes with the support of the federation, begin to operate mostly in the affected area, like the immediate affected area. And the expectation, not just of us, but a lot of organizations, is that anyone who's left the immediate area will need to come back to receive assistance. And that, we make a lot of assumptions about people who leave, but sometimes they're borrowing money, sometimes they're not ready to come back, and we're sort of incentivizing them to come to a disaster zone, essentially. And in the Bahamas, those areas included Abaco, Grand Bahama, and we also had teams in Nassau. And we knew that people went to other places. So with this application, we could continue communicating with them, and they could be sending messages back to us, so we could be surveying them. Just because they've left the area doesn't mean that they're no longer an affected population. And then instead of us only operating in this really narrow geographic space, we could really lean into our coordination role and begin engaging with other national societies who may not even necessarily be part of an appeal, but may have affected populations in their countries that they may or may not even know about, and they may want to start engaging with this population. Show you how this all works in practice. And the first step is for someone to hear about AccessRC and download it on their phone. And the way that we did that for the Ukraine response might be the same or different in other contexts, but this was the first time we've ever used it, so there wasn't a whole lot of knowledge about it, and we felt we needed to build some confidence that this was, a bona fide application being used by national societies. So in this instance, the way we did that was by hosting a landing page on the IFRC domain, and it lists various countries you'll see and the national societies where people could click and be taken to the next site to inform them about programs in that country. And then, as you'll see here, it also included things like initial safety kind of message, a short checklist, and a link to the application on either the App Store for Apple or Google Play Store. We also had QR codes that people could scan, and links were shared. People can also just search, for AccessRC, and they were able to download it that way. So there's a number of different ways for this first step to happen. Now, once the app is downloaded, there are also a number of in-app tutorials that help onboard new users and just kind of help them understand what the product is and how to use it. There's also a guided product tour, and they're a little bit difficult to do on a presentation, but they do help spotlight various places where we found people struggled the most in previous versions to help usher them through the various steps that they'll need to take once the app is downloaded. So now I'll go over the account creation part of the process, and it primarily involves two steps. First step is fairly quick but important. It primarily involves scanning a copy of your identity document. And in that process, it's going to look to verify that it's a real document, and then it'll also extract information from that ID into our record using an optical character recognition software. And we really need this to establish an account, and then later for program criteria. So it includes things like your name, gender, date of birth, etc. And for this, we're using a third-party provider for the ID part. But it's also important to note they are not collecting or storing any information in the process. There's also a way, if you don't have an ID, for people to alert the National Society that they're not in possession of a formal government ID, and that they can provide some other documentation that will be kind of manually reviewed, and essentially a process of casework by the National Society will be initiated. And it could, it could involve a number of different processes and outcomes depending on the context. And then the second part of this process is verifying that the person who is scanning the ID is the person who is in the ID, and they're not just like a picture of a picture, for example. And we do that just through either a passive or active liveness checks. And these steps can be repeated in a different part of the process if you want to make connections to other verified accounts. For example, to submit an application later in the process for a couple or a family. You essentially have 5 areas to navigate through. The first one is just your home screen, and it will show you if you've applied for any programs. It can also lead you to other parts of the application, such as your inbox or the settings, or to find a program. The next, I mentioned in the previous slide, is if you want to add connections to your family unit. And you can also manage your profile information there too. So there is the ability to correct mistakes. because the OCR is pretty good, but it's not 100% perfect. And we do get alerted anytime somebody makes a change. The third area is the one that most people are interested in and gets a lot of attention. It's where all the programs can be found, information about them, and you can push a button really easily to apply for it. We also have a news feature, and this is where we can put information on national societies or the IFRC. At the moment, it's just populated with a news feed. And then the final area is like our help center. So it's places where we have the frequently asked questions. And also we have the ability to receive feedback on the app or receive a ticket directly to the team. I won't go through all of those areas within the app, but I think it might be useful just to walk through this one on how to apply for a program. So the process is you'll click on the More button, and then there's going to be a number of pages like information on the criteria for the program, pre-checklist, the ability to add additional people, take a group selfie. You answer a number of questions. You may need to submit additional documentation if that's required, and then a quick review of your application before you hit the submit button. And then you'll see a black box at the bottom or sort of towards the bottom, and that was something we introduced in the last generation of the application because one of the top 3 reasons that people call the National Society helplines is to check on the status of their message. I mean, this is really common, right? So it's something I believe Amazon introduced in 2015. So when you order, an item, you know that it's been accepted, when it's on the way, and when it's going to be delivered. And it's very much the same concept here. It just gives people a better sense of what's happening with their application. This slide then shows what happens once we go through all those steps. We launch a program, people download the application, they create accounts, and apply for a program. And this was just the very first 10 days after launch in March of 2022 in Romania. And you'll see a few things on this dashboard. If you kind of start at the top with the figures, you get a sense of scale and speed. And how quickly people were applying for programs and how many had been approved, indicated by the amount of money that's dispersed and collected over towards the right-hand side. If you also look at the map, it's not just about speed and scale. This was really one of the key advantages for using this model, which was that people were dispersed all over Romania, and there was absolutely no way for the Romanian Red Cross to be able to reach all of those people, to even know where they were actually in the various locations around the country. So when that program launched with about a dozen people in Bucharest, you can really see how that spread entirely across the country. You can also see that we found peaks in the afternoon and the late evening when people started applying. So this was another piece of metadata that we normally wouldn't have, because we would normally just have registration centers in particular locations during particular times on certain days. But people were really registering around the clock, and we found that a lot of people were registering in the evenings around 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And this was heavily influenced by the fact that these were single mothers on the move, and they'd often take care of their children, feed them, wash them, put them to bed, and then they would later log on and see how they might be able to address their needs by registering for one of the programs in the evening. And that's something that we would have never been able to do in a more traditional model. I'd like to show a comparison between Romania and Poland, where we were targeting the same groups of people around the same period of time. So I'm first starting with Poland, where we didn't have digital self-enrollment available, and we were only working with the very first option that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, which is the more traditional in-person model. They were using loadable cards. They deployed about 7 delegates and had around 35 staff and volunteers, some of which had to be recruited just for the operation, particularly because of the language skills, the Ukrainian and Russian language skills. And they targeted an ambitious 4,400 households. And I'm saying ambitious because the Polish Red Cross had no experience using cash before. So even though there was a high number of Ukrainians coming into the country, like big in proportion to that 4,400, target. This was going to be the first time they ever tried distributing multi-purpose cash. And in the end, they were only able to focus on two areas, Warsaw and a town just nearby, and only reached 18% of that target. In Romania, they used digital self-enrollment and made assisted self-enrollment available as well. They employed a variety of different mechanisms, including cash pickup at MoneyGram agents, IBAN transfers, digital pickup, and then as a backup, they also had loadable cards that they used for a small percentage of people. There were only 3 IFRC delegates who focused on cash deployed to Romania, and they had about 10 staff and volunteers. Again, they had to recruit particularly Ukrainian-speaking volunteers. And with these models, mechanisms, and staff resourcing, they targeted 20,000 households. And we later identified around 42 hotspots where people registered around the country, and they reached 81% of the target. And that was probably even stopped a bit prematurely so that they could provide some space for other humanitarian actors to operate in Romania. This final slide just shows side by side what those two operations look like. One was a more traditional in-person model with 42 staff and volunteers reaching nearly 800 households, and the other with a digital self-enrollment and assisted self-enrollment, having about a quarter of the staff and volunteers reaching over 20 times the amount of people. This is just a snapshot of one of our current dashboards. So you can see that we've now expanded the use of this model beyond Romania into Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Montenegro, Lithuania, and Poland. And we've reached well over 250,000 people in the last year and a half or so. In addition to that, we had the pilot in Colombia, as I mentioned earlier, and we also have interest in using this in Georgia and Estonia. Now, this is a slightly older snapshot of a dashboard, and what it's showing us is the number of people who currently have active AccessRC accounts and where they're located. So, many people left Ukraine into the surrounding European countries and then moved beyond because, maybe they weren't Ukrainian. So they might have gone back to their home of origin, or, they may have had other connections around the world, or they may have even been from mixed households. So they might have gone back to a country where the partner was not Ukrainian. And this is just to connect to another activity that we did back in May of 2023, which was we sent out a global sentiment survey, which was just a latent link on the application and allowed us to reach people in all of these locations. So I think we listed it on the 8th of May, and within about 3 weeks, we had over 28,000 responses, literally from all over the world. So people were telling us, how they were doing, what their current needs were, and some insight into how they felt about their futures. So it's just another example of how the tool could be used outside of immediate distribution. So these were, people were answering questions, and they may not have even ever applied for a program. They just had an account. So it had a really wide reach. Is highlighting the barriers that using only in-person models can create to accessing services. And at the top of the slide now provides some examples of additional groups of people we can support if we offer more than one doorway into services.